Well, for some expert analysis on the meeting, we're going to bring in John Park, director of the Korea Working Group at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Welcome to our broadcast.
Thank you.
President Trump has called the South Korean-U.S. free trade agreement, known as KORUS, a horrible deal. He will renegotiate it or terminate it, he says. What do both sides want to come from this meeting?
I think right now it's a low bar. If you look at it from the perspective of these two leaders who are meeting for the very first time, there are many contentious issues that we just heard that they need to deal with. So creating a common ground in terms of this first meeting of these two leaders is the top priority. But as President Trump mentioned, there are these contentious issues that tonight that could go really late into the evening, but they have another set of meetings tomorrow as well. But the core issue really right now is North Korea and how to deal with North Korea. And as we've heard, the THAAD issue, this ballistic missile defense system, is going to be at the crux of how President Moon is going to try to balance Beijing and Washington.
Right. Moon Jae-in actually told the U.S. Chamber of Commerce just last night that in spite of a 12% decrease in global trade over the last 5 years, bilateral trade had risen by this amount, and that the U.S. market share in Korea's import market has increased, and Korea has also seen an increase in its share of U.S. import market. Tell us, what does Mr. Trump want to do to improve trade specifically?
So right now we're looking at last year's annual trade, about $144 billion between the United States and South Korea. But for the United States, there was a $17 billion trade deficit. And this is what President Trump is zeroing in on. And this is what he's mentioned on the campaign trail just before he got elected. So that really becomes a top priority for President Trump. But I think with a lot of the issues at hand, one of the efforts from the South Korean side is to emphasize the South Korean investment in the U.S. economy and the creation of U.S. jobs.
I want to come back to the point that you made about the THAAD missile defense system. Of course, the big focus, a common goal here, will be getting North Korea to abandon its nuclear program and the missile programs. Tell us, Mr. Trump has said in the past that South Korea should actually pay for the THAAD missile defense system. Do you believe this will be a talking point?
I think this is an issue that certainly the South Koreans hope to punt down in terms of kicking the can down the road, as it were. There is this regular U.S.-South Korean alliance discussion. They're called the burden-sharing negotiations. They're called the Special Measures Agreement. That is coming up in about a year's time. Ideally, the whole notion of who pays for THAAD and how it's paid for can be left to that process. But the contentious issue right now is just the deployment, the operationalization of THAAD. The Chinese have been adamant against the X-band radar, and how President Moon kind of weaves in between this very narrow space that he has to maneuver, I should say, is going to be the crux of how he handles this issue in the coming weeks, coming months.
John, we look back on when President Trump met with German Chancellor Angela Merkel and how tense that visit was. A lot of pressure this time around for it to go well between the two.
That's right. As I mentioned, this is the first meeting between the two leaders. And if you look at it, the benchmark in terms of how President Trump has already met with the other Asian neighbors of South Korea, China and Japan, sets a rather high bar. First off, they had their summit with President Trump in Mar-a-Lago. Given the scheduling and circumstances, there are other issues at play. But for President Moon to meet with President Trump in the White House, I think there's an effort on the South Korean side to make sure that this is a very successful summit and try to incorporate some of these positives, particularly this idea of South Korean investment and job creation here in the United States.
John Park, wonderful to see you live in Boston, director of the Korea Working Group at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government.